December 19th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Colonel Heinrich von Luttwitz stood ankle-deep in the frozen mud beside a captured American fuel depot, watching his men frantically pump gasoline into every container they could find. Steam rose from his breath in the bitter cold as he calculated 50,000 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel, enough to keep his entire Panzer regiment operational for weeks. For the first time in months, von Luttwitz allowed himself a moment of hope. His Tigers and Panthers would drink deeply tonight. Their engines would roar with renewed vigor, and perhaps, just perhaps, this desperate winter offensive might succeed after all. But as the amber liquid flowed through the rubber hoses, von Luttwitz was unknowingly witnessing the very instrument of his nation's doom. What he had stumbled upon wasn't merely a fuel depot. It was a single, insignificant droplet from an industrial ocean that stretched back across the Atlantic. A logistical torrent so vast and relentless that it would drown the Third Reich beneath waves of petroleum, steel, and incomprehensible abundance. This wasn't just about gasoline, this was the moment when the mathematics of modern warfare revealed themselves in all their crushing inevitability. When a career officer trained in the traditions of Prussian military excellence came face to face with the industrial reality that would pulverize his homeland into rubble and ash. The colonel had spent his entire adult life studying warfare, from the lightning campaigns of 1940 to the grinding attrition of the Eastern Front. He understood tactics, strategy, and the delicate choreography of mechanized combat. But nothing in his military education had prepared him for what those 50,000 gallons truly represented. Not salvation, but a revelation of such staggering disparity that it would shatter every assumption he held about his nation's capacity to wage war against the combined industrial might of America. Von Luttwitz had been fighting on fumes for so long that he had almost forgotten what abundance looked like. Since the summer of 1944, his regiment had been allocated precisely 127 gallons of fuel per tank per week, when they were lucky enough to receive any allocation at all. More often than not, his mechanical monsters sat silent in hidden positions, their crews reduced to infantry, while their steel behemoths gathered rust and snow. The Panther tanks that had once prowled the Russian steppes like apex predators now squatted motionless in Belgian forests. Magnificent predators transformed into elaborate steel coffins by something as mundane as an empty fuel tank. The mathematics of German fuel production told a story of systematic strangulation. The Reich's synthetic fuel plants, marvels of German engineering that had once seemed to promise energy independence, were producing a mere 12,000 tons of aviation gasoline per month by late 1944. The bombing campaigns had reduced the Lunar Works, once Germany's crown jewel of synthetic fuel production, to a smoldering maze of twisted pipes and shattered concrete. The Romanian oil fields that had sustained the Wehrmacht's early victories had been lost to Soviet advances in August. The Hungarian refineries were operating at 17% capacity, their output barely sufficient to keep a handful of training squadrons airborne. But those captured American fuel containers told a different story entirely. Each steel drum bore the markings of the Sinclair Refining Company, along with production dates that made von Luttwitz's hands tremble as he calculated the implications. These barrels had been filled in Texas refineries just 6 weeks earlier, had crossed 3,000 miles of ocean, had been unloaded at Cherbourg, transported across France, and distributed to forward supply depots, all with a casualness that spoke to resources so vast they defied comprehension. The logistics alone represented an operational capacity that dwarfed anything the German war machine had ever achieved, even in its moments of greatest triumph. The captured fuel was designated 115 over 145 octane aviation gasoline, a grade so pure and powerful that German aircraft engines, designed to run on 87-octane synthetic fuel, would actually perform better on this American petroleum than they had been designed for. The irony was not lost on von Luttwitz. The enemy was casually distributing fuel of such quality that it exceeded German engineering specifications. While his own Luftwaffe pilots were grounding their aircraft to conserve fuel, American bomber crews were burning fuel of higher quality than German designers had dared to dream of when they sketched their first jet engines. As his men continued their frantic pumping operation, von Luttwitz began to understand that he wasn't just looking at 50,000 gallons of gasoline. He was staring into the mechanical heart of American industrial capacity, and what he saw there was utterly terrifying. The markings on these containers revealed they had originated from 17 different refineries across Texas, Louisiana, and California. 17 facilities, each apparently capable of producing more fuel in a single month than all of Germany's synthetic plants combined. The casual abundance was overwhelming. These weren't strategic reserves hoarded for critical operations, but routine supplies distributed to forward positions with the same bureaucratic efficiency that the Wehrmacht used to distribute small arms ammunition. The intelligence reports that had been filtering back from captured American positions painted an even more devastating picture. American tank crews weren't just well supplied with fuel, they were wasteful with it. Captured Sherman tanks were found with full fuel tanks, their crews having abandoned perfectly operational vehicles rather than face the inconvenience of fighting without air support or artillery backup. American mechanized units moved with a profligacy that would have been considered criminal by German standards, their vehicles idling continuously to power radios and heaters, their logistics trains burning fuel in quantities that exceeded the entire operational allocation of a German panzer division. Von Lüttwitz had studied the intelligence estimates of American industrial production, but the raw numbers had seemed too fantastic to be credible. The United States was reportedly producing over 4 billion gallons of aviation gasoline annually, a figure so staggering that German analysts had dismissed it as Allied disinformation. But here, in a single captured depot, was evidence that those numbers weren't propaganda, but conservative estimates of an industrial machine that operated on scales that rendered European production capacity quaint and provincial. The broader implications began to crystallize in von Lüttwitz's mind with the inexorable logic of a mathematical proof. If this single fuel depot, captured almost by accident during a reconnaissance patrol, contained enough gasoline to sustain his entire regiment for weeks, then what did that suggest about American logistics capabilities? How many such depots existed across the Western Front? How many were being established even now, as his men celebrated their tiny windfall? The documents recovered from the depot's administrative bunker provided answers that von Lüttwitz almost wished he hadn't found. The depot was classified as a secondary forward supply point, one of 47 such facilities supporting American operations in the Ardennes sector alone. Each depot was designed to maintain a 30-day supply reserve, with automatic resupply convoys arriving every 72 hours. The fuel he was now commandeering represented less than half of this depot's normal capacity. The American unit that had abandoned it had already consumed the other half in just 3 weeks of routine operations. But it was the resupply documentation that truly revealed the scope of American capabilities. The convoy schedules showed a relentless stream of tanker trucks, each carrying 5,000 gallons, arriving at regular intervals along a supply line that stretched back through France to the Channel ports. The mathematics were inescapable. This single depot, one of dozens supporting just one sector of the front, was receiving more fuel weekly than von Lüttwitz's entire division had seen in the past 6 months. The quality of the American equipment told its own story of industrial supremacy. The fuel pumps were electric, powered by portable generators that hummed with mechanical precision. The hoses were reinforced rubber compounds that remained flexible even in the bitter Belgian cold, while German fuel lines had become brittle and prone to cracking in temperatures that barely reached freezing. Even the fuel containers themselves were superior, seamlessly welded steel drums that showed no signs of corrosion or leakage, compared to the German barrels that had been patched and repatched until they resembled mechanical collages of salvaged metal. Von Lüttwitz's communications officer approached with a captured American radio, its vacuum tubes glowing warmly in protective housing that had been machined to tolerances that exceeded anything in German military electronics. The radio was tuned to American logistics frequencies, and through the static came the routine chatter of a supply network that operated with the casual efficiency of a peacetime commercial enterprise. Convoy commanders reported fuel deliveries with the same administrative boredom that German quartermasters used to discuss bread rations, their voices carrying no hint of the desperate scarcity that had defined Wehrmacht operations for the past 2 years. Convoy Bravo, 7 to Distribution Central, crackled through the speaker. Delivery complete at Supply Point Tango 47. Offloaded 37,000 gallons JP4, 42,000 gallons motor gasoline, 12,000 gallons diesel. Request routing for next delivery. The casual mention of quantities that represented a month's allocation for an entire German armored division left von Lüttwitz staring at the radio in stunned silence. The response came with bureaucratic precision. Bravo. 7. Proceed to supply point uniform 21 for scheduled delivery tomorrow at 0800 hours. Manifest includes 50,000 gallons JP4, 60,000 gallons motor gasoline, 15,000 gallons diesel, plus miscellaneous lubricants and hydraulic fluids. The voice carried no more emotion than a railway conductor announcing train schedules, yet was describing fuel movements that exceeded the entire operational capacity of Army Group West. As the night wore on and his men continued transferring the precious fuel, von Lüttwitz began to grasp the full horror of Germany's strategic position. This depot, with its modest 50,000 gallons, wasn't an exceptional concentration of resources. It was routine, mundane, one small node in a supply network that spanned the globe. The United States wasn't just outproducing Germany. It was operating on an entirely different scale of industrial organization, one that treated fuel quantities that could sustain entire German campaigns as routine logistics entries in daily supply reports. The intelligence documents recovered from the depot's command post revealed the broader architecture of American petroleum logistics. The Trans-Arabian Pipeline was delivering 800,000 barrels of crude oil daily to Mediterranean refineries. The Big Inch Pipeline was moving 300,000 barrels daily from Texas oil fields to East Coast refineries. Venezuelan production had increased to 1.5 million barrels daily, most of it destined for American military consumption. The numbers represented an oil economy that dwarfed not just German production but German conception of what industrial production could achieve. But the most devastating revelation came from a routine logistics memorandum, dated just 2 weeks earlier. American fuel consumption in the European theater had reached 2.3 million gallons daily, and was projected to increase to 3.1 million gallons daily by spring of 1945. Those numbers represented more fuel consumed in a single day than Germany's entire synthetic fuel industry could produce in a month. The Americans weren't just winning the war through superior resources, they were drowning it in petroleum, suffocating German mobility beneath an ocean of gasoline that stretched back across the Atlantic to oil fields and refineries that operated beyond the reach of Luftwaffe bombers or U-boat torpedoes. Von Lüttwitz found himself studying captured American vehicle maintenance manuals, marveling at maintenance schedules that assumed unlimited fuel availability. American tank crews were instructed to run their engines for 30 minutes daily, even when stationary, to prevent mechanical problems in cold weather. German tank crews were forbidden from starting their engines except during actual combat operations. American aircraft maintenance procedures included regular high-power engine runs to clear carbon deposits procedures that German mechanics hadn't performed since 1943 because they couldn't spare the fuel. The contrast extended beyond mere quantities to fundamental differences in operational philosophy. American units moved with the mechanical rhythm of industrial processes, their operations synchronized to the steady flow of supply convoys that operated with assembly line precision. German units had learned to fight like predatory animals, hoarding resources and striking only when opportunity presented overwhelming advantage. The Americans had industrialized warfare itself, transforming military operations into a production process that consumed raw materials and produced tactical victories with the same methodical efficiency that their factories produced trucks and aircraft. The captured depot's inventory sheets revealed supply redundancies that would have been incomprehensible to German quartermasters. The Americans maintained separate stockpiles of different fuel grades for different operational requirements: 80 octane for trucks and generators, 100 octane for fighters, 115 octane for bombers, plus specialized fuels for rockets, flamethrowers, and experimental jet engines. German forces had been reduced to a single, low-quality synthetic fuel that barely met minimum operational requirements for any application. As dawn approached, von Lüttwitz's men had completed their transfer operations, but their colonel had undergone a transformation that would haunt him for the remainder of the war. The captured fuel would indeed allow his regiment to participate in what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. But von Lüttwitz now understood that they weren't advancing toward victory. They were consuming the last drops of fuel that stood between the Wehrmacht and complete paralysis. The radio intercepts continued throughout the night, revealing the scope of American logistics operations with the casual detail of routine military communications. Supply convoys reported their positions with precision that implied satellite navigation decades before such technology existed, their coordination achieved through radio networks that operated with commercial-grade reliability. The contrast with German communications, dependent on courier motorcycles because radio fuel couldn't be spared for continuous operation, was absolute and damning. Von Lüttwitz began to understand that the 50,000 gallons he had captured represented more than fuel. It was evidence of an industrial ecosystem that operated according to principles that German leadership had never comprehended. American war production wasn't constrained by raw material shortages, transportation bottlenecks, or manufacturing limitations. It was constrained only by the organizational capacity to coordinate resources on scales that spanned continents. The petroleum that now filled his vehicles had originated in oil fields scattered across Texas, Louisiana, California, and Venezuela. It had been refined in facilities that operated continuously, processed through distribution networks that spanned the Western Hemisphere, transported across oceans by tanker fleets that dwarfed the entire German merchant marine, and delivered to European battlefields through logistics systems that treated intercontinental fuel transportation as routine commercial activity. But the most devastating realization came from the captured American fuel consumption projections for 1,945. The documents indicated that American forces in Europe alone would consume over 1 billion gallons of fuel in the coming year, more petroleum than the entire German war machine had consumed since 1939. This wasn't just superior logistics. It was warfare prosecuted on scales that rendered traditional military calculations meaningless. Von Lüttwitz had been trained to think in terms of tactical fuel allocations, strategic petroleum reserves, and operational ranges measured in kilometers per liter. But American military doctrine operated according to entirely different assumptions, treating fuel abundance as a basic precondition for military operations rather than a critical limiting factor. Their tactical manuals assumed unlimited mobility. Their strategic planning incorporated fuel-intensive operations that would have been impossible for German forces to contemplate. The intelligence estimates of American petroleum production revealed an industrial machine that had shifted into total war production with an efficiency that exceeded even German industrial mobilization at its peak. American refinery capacity had increased from 1.8 million barrels daily in 1940 to over 4.2 million barrels daily in 1944, with most of the increase dedicated to military-grade fuels. This represented more refining capacity than existed in the entire Axis alliance, including conquered territories and reluctant allies. But production capacity was only part of the equation. The captured logistics documents revealed transportation systems that moved petroleum products with the efficiency of natural phenomena. The American pipeline network had been expanded to carry over 2 million barrels daily from southwestern oil fields to East Coast refineries and distribution centers. This single transportation system could move more fuel in a day than Germany produced in a month, and it operated as reliably as geological processes, its flow maintained by engineering systems that functioned beyond the reach of military interference. The maritime component of American petroleum logistics represented perhaps the most devastating demonstration of industrial superiority. The captured documents referenced tanker fleets that included over 400 vessels dedicated exclusively to military fuel transportation. These ships, many of them constructed in American shipyards during the war, represented more cargo capacity than the entire German merchant marine at its pre-war peak. Each vessel carried between 10,000 and 16,000 tons of petroleum products, making single voyages that delivered more fuel than German synthetic plants produced in months. Von Lüttwitz found himself studying manifests from individual tanker voyages, marveling at cargo lists that read like catalogues of industrial abundance. A single Liberty ship had delivered 12,000 tons of aviation gasoline, 8,000 tons of motor gasoline, 4,000 tons of diesel fuel, and 2,000 tons of specialized lubricants to Cherbourg in November 1944. This single cargo delivery represented more petroleum products than his entire army group had received since the beginning of the Ardennes offensive. The strategic implications became inescapable as von Lüttwitz calculated the mathematics of industrial warfare. Germany's total petroleum production, including synthetic plants, captured refineries, and remaining natural sources, had fallen to approximately 1.2 million tons annually by late 1944. American petroleum production exceeded 200 million tons annually, with over 40 million tons allocated specifically for military consumption. The disparity wasn't just quantitative, it was categorical, representing the difference between an industrial economy stretched to its absolute limits and one operating comfortably within its production capacity. But the most sobering revelation came from captured American planning documents that projected fuel requirements for 1,945. The United States expected to produce over 250 million tons of petroleum products in the coming year, with military allocations increasing to over 50 million tons. These projections treated fuel consumption rates that would bankrupt the German war economy as routine administrative planning, incorporating growth assumptions that exceeded total German production capacity. The organizational sophistication of American petroleum logistics revealed industrial management capabilities that had no equivalent in German war production. The captured documents showed coordination between civilian oil companies, military supply services, and allied governments that achieved resource allocation efficiency exceeding anything in German economic planning. Companies like Standard Oil, Texaco, and Gulf had been integrated into military supply chains with the seamless precision of machine components, their civilian production capacity redirected toward military requirements, without disrupting the fundamental commercial structure that made such production possible. Von Lüttwitz began to understand that American war production operated according to principles that German industrial leadership had never grasped. Rather than replacing civilian production with military manufacturing, American industry had expanded total production capacity to accommodate both civilian and military requirements simultaneously. This represented a fundamental difference in economic organization that went far beyond superior resources or manufacturing technology. The petroleum industry provided the most dramatic illustration of this organizational superiority. American refineries were producing military-grade fuels in quantities that exceeded total German petroleum consumption, while simultaneously maintaining civilian gasoline production at levels that supported unrestricted automobile usage throughout the American home front. German civilians hadn't seen private automobile fuel since 1942, yet Americans were producing enough petroleum to fight a global war while maintaining peacetime transportation consumption. The captured fuel depot had been supplied through a logistics network that included over 50,000 trucks, 15,000 railroad tank cars, and 400 ocean-going tankers, all dedicated specifically to military fuel distribution. This transportation system represented more vehicles than the entire German motor pool, yet constituted only one component of American military logistics. The trucks alone consumed more fuel in a month than many German divisions received for combat operations, yet their fuel consumption was treated as routine logistics overhead rather than strategic resource allocation. Von Lüttwitz found himself studying American fuel consumption statistics with the fascination of an archaeologist examining artifacts from an alien civilization. American bomber operations consumed over 100,000 gallons of aviation fuel per mission, with multiple missions flown daily from dozens of airfields across England and Italy. Single bombing raids consumed more fuel than the entire Luftwaffe had available for weekly operations. Yet American air operations continued with the mechanical regularity of industrial processes. The intelligence reports indicated that American aircraft production had reached over 96,000 units annually by 1944, with each aircraft delivered complete with full fuel loads and spare parts inventories that exceeded the equipment available to entire German squadrons. This wasn't just superior production, it was manufacturing abundance that treated strategic weapons as commercial products, delivered complete and ready for immediate operational deployment. But perhaps the most devastating indication of American industrial capacity came from reports of fuel wastage that would have been considered sabotage by German standards. Captured American positions regularly contained abandoned vehicles with full fuel tanks. their crews having determined that the tactical disadvantages of defending without air support or artillery backup exceeded the strategic value of conserving petroleum products. German forces had been trained to fight entire campaigns with less fuel than American units, abandoned during routine tactical withdrawals. The mathematics of industrial warfare began to reveal their inexorable logic as von Lüttwitz calculated the strategic implications of what he had discovered. Germany was fighting an enemy that possessed petroleum reserves exceeding 50 billion barrels, production capacity exceeding 200 million tons annually, and logistics systems capable of delivering fuel across intercontinental distances with commercial reliability. The Third Reich was attempting to wage mechanized warfare against an industrial civilization that treated petroleum abundance as a basic assumption of economic organization. The captured American planning documents projected military fuel requirements through 1946, incorporating operational assumptions that revealed the fundamental disparity between American and German strategic thinking. American planners expected to maintain fuel consumption rates of over 3 million gallons daily for European operations alone, with additional allocations for Pacific theater operations, strategic bombing campaigns, and occupation duties. These consumption projections exceeded total German fuel production capacity by orders of magnitude, yet represented only one component of American military resource allocation. Von Lüttwitz began to comprehend that the 50,000 gallons he had captured weren't just fuel, they were a revelation of industrial capacity that rendered German victory impossible regardless of tactical brilliance or operational skill. The Wehrmacht was fighting with swords against an enemy armed with industrial processes, attempting to achieve through military excellence what could only be sustained through economic abundance. The radio intercepts continued throughout his time at the depot, providing a constant stream of evidence regarding American logistics capabilities. Supply convoys reported fuel deliveries with the bureaucratic precision of commercial shipping, their operations coordinated through communication networks that operated with reliability exceeding German strategic communications. The casual efficiency was overwhelming. American quartermasters discussed fuel allocations exceeding German strategic reserves with the same administrative boredom that Wehrmacht supply officers used to request ammunition requisitions. As von Lüttwitz prepared to abandon the depot and continue his advance toward Bastogne, he encountered a captured American logistics officer who had been wounded during the depot's evacuation. Captain James Morrison, of the 82nd Supply Battalion, bleeding from shrapnel wounds but conscious enough to speak, provided the final piece of evidence that confirmed von Lüttwitz's growing understanding of American industrial supremacy. "You can take all the fuel you want, Colonel," Morrison said through gritted teeth as German medics bandaged his wounds. "There's more petroleum flowing through American pipelines every day than your entire country produces in a year. You're fighting the Industrial Revolution itself, and industry doesn't surrender, it just builds more factories." The American officer's words carried the conviction of someone who had witnessed industrial processes that operated beyond German comprehension. Morrison had been responsible for coordinating fuel deliveries across a supply network that spanned 3 countries and 2 ocean crossings, managing petroleum flows that exceeded the entire German war economy through radio communications and administrative procedures that operated with the reliability of mechanical processes. "Your intelligence services probably told you that American oil production peaked before the war," Morrison continued, his voice gaining strength despite his injuries. "They were wrong. We're producing more petroleum now than we ever produced in peacetime, and we're building refinery capacity faster than you're destroying it with your bombers. Every month, American industry adds more fuel production capacity than Germany has left." Von Lüttwitz found himself believing the wounded American, not because of any particular credibility the man possessed, but because the evidence surrounding them supported every claim Morrison made. The captured depot itself represented petroleum abundance that exceeded German industrial capacity, yet constituted merely one small component of American logistics operations that spanned continents. Morrison gestured weakly toward the empty fuel containers that von Lüttwitz's men were loading onto their vehicles. Those drums were filled in Texas refineries 6 weeks ago, shipped across 3,000 miles of ocean, transported through France on trucks that burn more fuel in a day than your tanks carry, and delivered to this depot by supply crews who treat intercontinental fuel transportation as routine commercial activity. And this is just one depot out of hundreds, supplying just one sector of just one front in a global war that America is fighting simultaneously in Europe, the Pacific, and half a dozen other theaters. The wounded officer's words crystallized the strategic reality that von Lüttwitz had been struggling to comprehend. Germany wasn't just fighting the United States, it was fighting an industrial civilization that had achieved resource abundance through organizational methods that rendered traditional military calculations obsolete. American war production operated according to principles that treated strategic materials as commercial products, applying industrial management techniques that achieved efficiency levels exceeding anything in European economic organization. Your synthetic fuel plants were impressive engineering achievements, Morrison continued, his voice carrying grudging respect for German technical capabilities. But they were built to replace petroleum imports that America produces as routine commercial output. You industrialized scarcity while we industrialized abundance. That's not a military disadvantage, Colonel. That's economic checkmate. Von Lüttwitz ordered his men to treat Captain Morrison with the courtesy due a fellow officer, but privately he recognized that the American had articulated the fundamental strategic reality that would determine the war's outcome. Germany had achieved tactical excellence through disciplined resource allocation, training elite forces to operate effectively despite material limitations. America had achieved strategic supremacy through industrial abundance, training adequate forces to operate with material advantages that rendered tactical excellence irrelevant. As his regiment prepared to resume its advance, von Lüttwitz took one final look at the captured fuel depot. The 50,000 gallons now fueling his tanks represented more petroleum than many German divisions would receive during their entire combat careers, yet constituted less than one day's routine consumption for equivalent American forces. The disparity wasn't just quantitative. It revealed fundamental differences in industrial organization that made German victory impossible regardless of military skill or operational brilliance. The Battle of the Bulge would continue for another month, and von Lüttwitz's regiment would fight with the desperate courage that had characterized German forces throughout the war's final years. But the colonel now understood that they weren't advancing toward victory. They were consuming the last reserves of fuel that stood between the Wehrmacht and complete paralysis. The captured American fuel would allow them to fight a few more battles, but it couldn't alter the mathematical inevitability that governed modern industrial warfare. The radio in his command vehicle crackled with German communications as his regiment resumed its advance, but von Lüttwitz found himself listening instead to the American logistics frequencies that continued to operate with commercial reliability. Supply convoys reported fuel deliveries, refinery operations, coordinated product distribution, and strategic planners discussed petroleum allocations that exceeded German production capacity with the bureaucratic precision of peacetime commercial activity. The inexorable mathematics of industrial warfare had revealed themselves with crystalline clarity in those 50,000 gallons of captured American fuel. Germany was fighting an enemy that possessed petroleum reserves exceeding the combined oil wealth of the Middle East, production capacity that exceeded German industrial output by orders of magnitude, and logistics systems that operated with efficiency, transcending anything in European economic organization. The Wehrmacht had achieved tactical excellence through disciplined resource management, but America had achieved strategic invincibility through industrial abundance. Von Lüttwitz understood now that the war's outcome had been determined not by military factors, but by economic realities that rendered German victory impossible from the moment American industry shifted into war production. The Third Reich was attempting to defeat an industrial civilization through military means, fighting against economic forces that operated beyond the reach of tactical brilliance or operational skill. As his Panthers and Tigers rumbled forward through the Belgian snow, their engines running smoothly on high-quality American fuel, Colonel Heinrich von Lüttwitz carried with him the terrible knowledge that they were advancing toward inevitable defeat. The captured fuel depot hadn't provided salvation. It had revealed the scope of German strategic failure with the mathematical precision of an engineering calculation. The 50,000 gallons that now powered his advance represented more than petroleum. They were evidence of American industrial supremacy so complete that German resistance had become a mathematical impossibility. The Third Reich was drowning in an ocean of Allied production that stretched back across the Atlantic to oil fields, refineries, and manufacturing centers that operated beyond the reach of German military power. In the end, the story of those 50,000 gallons was the story of the war itself, a revelation of industrial capacity, so vast and systematic that it had transformed military conflict into economic process, reducing German tactical excellence to irrelevant anachronism in the face of American production abundance. Von Lüttwitz had captured enough fuel to sustain his regiment for weeks, but he had also discovered why Germany could not win a war against an enemy that measured strategic resources in quantities that exceeded German comprehension. The mathematics of destruction had been loaded into those fuel drums just as surely as high explosives were loaded into artillery shells, and they would prove just as devastating to German hopes of victory. Industrial warfare had revealed its fundamental law. Abundance defeats excellence, production conquers skill, and economic organization determines military outcome with the inexorable precision of physical law. Germany had fought magnificently, but magnificence cannot defeat mathematics, and the mathematics of modern war had been written in petroleum, steel, and the industrial capacity to transform raw materials into overwhelming tactical advantage.